Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. My guest today is Sebastian Major, the writer and presenter of the excellent Our Fake History podcast. If you aren't familiar with it, Our Fake History analyses a wide range of historical topics, clarifies common misconceptions, and debunks a lot of bad history. I've been enjoying Sebastian's show for several years now, and I recommend it very highly. So when he announced on Twitter that he was going to tackle the very thorny topic of the Galileo Affair, I was really interested. And given my study of that subject, I had some comments and a few criticisms to make about his analysis. Overall, I thought he did a fantastic job, but Galileo is one of those topics that is very hard to get right. To his great credit, Sebastian not only took my comments on board, but even acknowledged my feedback in the third of his three-part Galileo episode. And he was also gracious enough to accept my invitation to come on History for Atheists to discuss the difficulties of presenting complex historical topics accurately, as well as his thoughts on debunking historical myths and the persistence of bad history in popular culture. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Sebastian as much as I did. Sebastian Major, thank you for coming on the show and welcome to History for Atheists. And as I was just saying as we were chatting, it's great to put a face to the voice. I've been quite an avid listener and quite a fan of your podcast, which is Our Fake History. I discovered it, I think, a couple of years ago and found that I listened to a couple of episodes with trepidation and realised that, no, you actually do know what you're talking about. So absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for the warm welcome, Tim. I know you are a discerning critic, so I appreciate those kind words.
No problem. Well, for those who aren't familiar with your podcast, and I do recommend it very highly and I recommend it very often, maybe you could just give us a quick introduction about your background, how you got into this whole podcasting thing and what the show is all about.
Sure. So Our Fake History is a podcast about historical myths. So those are stories that got wrapped up in the historical record that a lot of people believe to be true, get repeated all of the time, but may or may not be accurate. So I kind of go at it from two different angles. Sometimes I look at a story that everyone thinks is true and is often repeated as real history, and I'll sort of do some historical detective work to try and give a more accurate understanding of that story. Or I'll go at it from the other direction where I'll get into a legend that everyone believes is pure fiction, or something like the Trojan War or King Arthur or a story like that a lot of people just sort of assume is more legendary than it is historical, and explore the various theories on whether or not there's some a kernel of historical truth to those tales. So that's what the podcast is all about. I got into it in 2015. I started the show. I am a high school teacher by trade. But I have just transitioned into being a full-time podcaster. But when I started the show, I was a high school teacher in Toronto, Canada, and I taught history, I taught English, I taught all sorts of other social science courses at the high school level, and I loved telling stories in my history classes. I'm kind of a storyteller at heart. And one day I was, going off about the wild story of Rasputin's assassination. And I was like in the midst of, giving the whole tale about they tried to poison him, and then he gets back up and they shoot him, and then he comes back to life, and they just can't kill this guy. And I was really, laying it on thick with the Rasputin tale. And one of my students actually called me out in that moment. They're like, "Hey, isn't this all just a myth? Isn't this all just a legend? Why are you telling us this like this really happened?" And I was like, well, I was just trying to make a good hook. I was trying to bring you into the class. But you know what? You're right. It is kind of a wild story. It does sort of defy logic in a lot of ways. And so that night I went home I did a bunch of research into Rasputin, and what I found was that that tale comes from a really specific source. It comes from this one particular Russian aristocrat who is untrustworthy for a number of reasons. And so I kind of was like, I should turn this into an actual history class. And so I came back the next time we had that class, and I had kind of created a lesson that was all about examining the different sources that we have about the death of Rasputin, and then like trying to determine what we think actually happened. And it was, I think, one of my better moments as a history teacher. And so I was like, and I'd been mulling over starting a podcast for a long time. I loved history podcasts. There was a handful of history podcasts I really loved. And I was like, I was thinking about throwing my hat into the ring. And after that day, I came home and told my wife, I'm like, I think this is it. I think this is the angle, right? This is the way to talk about history that maybe is a little bit more fresh. At the time, I didn't know of anyone else that was doing it exactly the way that I wanted to do it. And so I'm like, I'm going to try it. And over the past 7 years, the show has gained a listenership. And now I've been able to make it my main gig. So yeah, that's my tale. That's the story of our fake history.
It's a good origin story. And yeah, it's interesting you just mentioned that Rasputin story, because for years I thought that was the truth. Because
Sure.
it's a great story. It's brilliant. He kept getting back up, and then they threw him in the river, and when they found him, his body, eventually they realized he'd drowned, and he'd been shot and poisoned and flogged with chains and all this stuff. So I used to tell people that story for years, until one day I read somewhere that it wasn't true. Now the funny thing is, I kind of like stuff getting debunked, which is probably why I do what I do, and possibly why you do what you do, because you've said it, and I've said it many times. I've heard you say it in your most recent episodes, and I think before, the real story is much more interesting. And I always find that the real story is always more complex, it's more nuanced, it's more shades of grey, and it's more real. Whereas I find many other people, we can possibly get onto this a bit later in the conversation, but many other people much prefer the myth and get quite angry when you come along and shatter the myth. But I had a very similar experience to you on the Rasputin story. I think it was in my first year of university, when I thought I knew, like everyone, I thought I knew the Galileo story.
Right.
I clear that Galileo was a martyr of science and champion of reason, and the church was evil and superstitious and ignorant and oppressed him, and he was right and they were wrong. And I remember the first time while studying history, talking to someone about something else, and he said, yeah, well, of course the whole Galileo story is that everyone knows is wrong, and actually the church had the science on its side. And I remember thinking, well, that's not true. And the fact that this guy was a Catholic and I was an atheist made me immediately think that he must be wrong.
Sure.
And, with great confidence, I went off to the library to be able to come back to him next class and tell him he was wrong, and found that he was right. Which leads us to why you and I had started talking in the first place, Sebastian, because for those who do follow Sebastian's podcast, you would know he has recently just finished an epic 3-part series on the Galileo Affair, getting to the bottom of what actually happened and debunking some key myths. And Sebastian, I'm going to do some nitpicking, but I will.
All right. That's all right. That's why we're here, right?
It is, but it's partly why. But I did want to say congratulations on those episodes. They were 3 very long. I think it was 3 hours all up.
Yeah, that ended up being one of my longer series. The final, normally I like the shows to come in under an hour, and for part 3, it ended up being like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
But part of that was spurred on by your comments on my earlier episodes. And so I'm like, I need to be, I need to make a correction. And then I really wanted to be on top of stuff, and it still wasn't perfect. But let's talk about it. Let's get into it.
Yeah, let's talk about it. But I did want to stress that it is a great show and a great episode, or a great 3-part episode, because it's an incredibly difficult subject. And I think you might have announced that you were going to do it, and I thought, gee, good luck, mate.
Good luck, man.
It's a huge topic, and I've been studying it for, excuse me, literally 35 years.
Right.
And every time I read something new, I get a different angle or a slightly different perspective or a new kind of understanding of it, because you can look at it from so many different perspectives. You can look at it from a purely scientific perspective. You can look at it from the perspective of the myth that arose around Galileo. You can look at it from a theological perspective. You can look at it from a social perspective regarding what was going on in Europe at the time, the Counter-Reformation, the 30 Years' War, political perspective, personal politics. And it's just every time you change your angle on it, you get a different view.
Yeah.
But I suppose the thing about it is it's something that everyone knows. And I often say with Galileo, tell me about who taught you the story of Galileo? And the answer is most people have never been taught the story. You just kind of pick it up. I don't remember a point where a history teacher stood up or a social science teacher stood up and taught me the Galileo story. You just kind of pick it up. And so what we get isn't the real story, it's the myth.
Yeah.
And that was what you were trying to debunk, which I think on the whole, you definitely did, particularly the idea that the church was stupid, unscientific, and ignorant, and Galileo was a hero and wise and pure. And I love the way you kept coming back to that nickname that he got at university, the Wrangler.
Yeah.
No matter what the topic was at university, he would always get the conversation around to what he wanted. And I think you use that as a really nice theme.
Yeah, that ended up revealing itself as a real hook for me. Like, well, once I heard, I even said it on the show, right? Once I discovered that, I'm like, oh, I know this guy. I've met this guy.
We've been to university with that guy,
Yeah.
The one who was always right even when he was wrong, because he was really smart.
Yeah.
And funny.
Yeah.
Which Galileo, he was all of the above.
Oh.
Galileo's hilarious.
That was another nice thing to learn.
Yeah.
That was another nice thing to learn, because I love it when you learn that a historical figure had a sense of humor, because oftentimes we see them as these sort of two-dimensional figures. And when you find out they were funny, especially when you get further and further back in history, when they seem so distant from us and you're like, oh, this person was witty. That's great. But Galileo, not only being funny, he was mean funny, he was biting.
Yeah. And this is what I just said. He would have made a great Twitter troll. He was brilliant. Some of his letters are hilarious, particularly his letters about people he didn't like.
Yeah.
And the group of scholars at Padua University who were his main sort of opponents and who he kept beating in arguments were led by a guy called Colomb, which, of course, in Italian and Latin means both dove and also pigeon. And so he called them the Pigeon League.
Right. Yeah.
And he was writing in his letters, the Pigeon League is pecking at me again. He was very funny.
Yeah, and that was something that I was unfortunately unable to really get into in the show. There was so much to cover. Yeah. And I know that in our exchanges, you brought up that, you really wished I could have, paid more attention to the kind of role that the Pigeon League was playing in the whole affair. And, I think I never even used the term Pigeon League. I only kind of gave a very passing mention to it when I talked about some of the satire in the Dialogue on the Two Worlds, that one of the characters was based on Cologne, but I didn't even name him because I didn't want to add another name into the podcast. But this is sort of part of the difficulty of telling a really nuanced story while also having to kind of remain within the constraints of the form. But there you go.
And I think as I said, I think you did a brilliant job. And I could tell listening to it that I could almost hear you sort of going, okay, that bit I can't tell because I'm going to go off down the rabbit hole there. Yeah. And you said a hell of a lot of detail remained on the cutting room floor, I think, in your conclusion. And you could sort of tell that. I suppose the reason in my notes back to you the other day, the reason I kind of picked up on the Pigeon League thing is unless I think a lot of people have this fixed idea of it being a church versus science, like creationism versus evolution sort of a scenario, which it wasn't. And I think the reason the Pigeon League is important in the story is that they included churchmen, but they were largely academics.
Right.
And I've worked at university. I know what academics are like. They are most petty and vindictive and mean people when it comes to their little vendettas. And I've come across the Pigeon League. I've met those guys too. So the thing was that the church really didn't care about Galileo. They didn't even care the fact that he had come out in 1613 in his letter on sunspots and said, I'm pretty much a Copernican. I mean, he virtually stated it. They passed that he submitted that to the Inquisition for approval, for publication, and they said, yeah, no problem. So, and this is something that a lot of people don't get. They kind of think that he was under the radar until suddenly the church pounced on him, but he wasn't. What happened was the Pigeon League saw his dabbling in theology, which he really didn't start doing until 1614.
Right.
And thought, here's our chance to finally get this guy who keeps beating us. And they were the ones who brought it to the attention of the Inquisition. The Inquisition weren't paying any attention to this stuff. And then the Inquisition even looked at his letter to Castelli, which was his foray into theology, which you talked about, and came back and said, we don't have a problem with this. Even when they brought the theological dabbling up, he said, the Inquisition came back and said, he uses some immoderate language, but we don't see anything that is out of kilter with the teachings of the Catholic Church.
Right.
So
yeah.
by that stage, the theological implications of heliocentrism, that cat was out of the bag. And another bit that you weren't able to bring in was that because it's just too complicated, was Paolo Foscarini wrote his book, which was arguing along similar lines to Galileo on the theological implications, and that's what really brought it to a head. And all this kind of came together in 1615 and resulted in the 1616 ruling that said it's false in philosophy, i.e., scientifically wrong. Therefore, it's dangerously close to, it's formally heretical, so close to being heretical.
Yeah.
And I think that last point is something that a lot of people don't get either.
Yeah.
It was never declared heresy.
Well, that's right. And that was actually something that, even I found myself having to learn about as I was sort of researching this particular topic, was the idea of like these ideas, by the time they come around to making their ruling on Copernicus, they never officially declare it like an out and out heresy, but they use all of this language around heresy, which for someone that's not like, deep in the world of 17th century church politics is very confusing. And this is where I think, the biggest myth, right, and the most obviously sort of wrong one is that Galileo himself was condemned as a heretic, which he was not, right? But the final ruling said that he was vehemently suspected of heresy. Now, if you're not like really up on the nuances of how the Inquisition made these rulings, it would be hard to see the difference, right?
Yeah, and I explain that to people, and people just go, well, you're splitting hairs. I'm like, I'm not.
Well,
given that you could be burned at the stake for being an unrepentant heretic.
Yes.
Whereas you really would have to work pretty hard to get any kind of capital or corporal punishment for simply being vehemently suspect of heresy. The issue, as I understand it, and I'm definitely not an expert in 17th century theology, but the issue, I believe, is that only the Pope and an ecumenical council could declare something that hadn't been examined before to be heresy.
Right.
So what the Inquisition could do was apply those rulings, or on other things they had these lower grades. So vehemently suspect of heresy is one of those lower grades, and formally heretical. A lot of people read that and think, well, that means they are officially declaring it heretical. They're formalizing it. It's not true. Formally means heretical in shape. So it basically means close to heresy. Heresy adjacent is possibly a modern way of putting it.
Yeah. And they called Copernicus false and erroneous, right? And again, these are all English translations too, which is already obfuscates something too, right? And, but again, exactly. Like, it's funny. People give you, a hard time for splitting hairs, but the people that really split hairs were the 17th century Inquisition, because it was extremely important to them exactly how all of those things were formulated, exactly how all of those things were worded. And Galileo's trial really came down, well, didn't come down to it. I shouldn't say that. There was a lot of discussion around, like, what does it mean to hold a belief versus just discussing a belief, and so that was, all of these little nuances were incredibly important to it in the end.
Yeah, and the fine passing of that last point was, you could see it when you're reading the transcripts of his interrogations. He's sort of saying, "Well, no, I've never actually held Copernicanism, but I kind of was inclined towards it. But then the 1616 ruling was made, and of course, I completely rejected it." None of which I think is actually true.
No.
I think if you read his letters on sunspots and his personal correspondence, he definitely believed that it was true. But the interesting thing is, a lot of people don't seem to realize that everyone agreed that it hadn't been proven. And everyone agreed that he hadn't proven it. He wanted to. He was working towards that. He wanted the intellectual and theological breathing room to do that. That was what he was working towards. Mm-hmm. But we've got and people have said to me, "Oh, well, of course he said that." Well, we've got private notes that he wrote. His commentary, I believe it was on Foscarini's book, might have been on Bellarmine's response to Foscarini. But he basically said, well, we haven't proven it yet. And even if it was, I think it was 85% proven, that still wouldn't be good enough. So he was actually raising the bar very, very high. But he wanted to breach that bar. Because he was a bit of a celebrity, he wanted to be the guy who had cracked it. And that was why he was frustrated by the 1616 ruling that said that he wasn't allowed to discuss it. And he tried to kind of get his way around that. But I think the other interesting thing that I think you nailed was the idea that the church just couldn't contemplate the idea of heliocentrism, which is something that a lot of people think about this. Mm-hmm. It is simply not true. Yeah, because the idea had been kicking around for quite a while. Since Leviticus.
But you made a good point. And one of my sort of first times I stumbled, and one of the things that first could have got us in communication was that I and again, I've since sort of learned better, but part of the myth of Copernicus is that he had essentially proved heliocentrism with his work. And this gets like tossed around a lot. And it was a myth that I had kind of absorbed. And so, even someone that spends their time trying to debunk historical myths, get clarity on that stuff, I had thoroughly absorbed that one, that nope, Copernicus as a brilliant mathematician figured it out, right? And it was there, and it was kept quiet. I realized that it was not. So when I did the research the first time around, did that first episode, I was like, okay, well, they didn't ban his book, which was already a bit of a surprise to me when I learned that. And I was sort of, I was not skeptical enough about one of the narratives about why they did not ban his book, which was that his printer, his sort of friend who got him to put it out there, Osiander, he had written this preface, and there's some people that have gone, and I didn't say this on the show, but there's some people that have said this preface is the greatest crime against science ever committed in the 16th century. But for your listeners that don't know, the preface to Copernicus's book, written by this other guy, not signed by anyone, so it kind of had the implication that maybe Copernicus wrote it, which he did not. Was like, hey, everything in this book is just sort of hypothetical and, shouldn't be taken for truth. And like, this is really just for mathematicians and not for general reading. So no one need get too upset about it. If I can paraphrase Ossiander. And so, there's a narrative out there that's what kept Copernicus from being banned, or for that book from being banned on the rotation of the celestial spheres. But and that's where you kind of were like, hey, no, that's a narrative. And you directed me towards some really good stuff that really showed that I've come to believe, because I think the evidence points to the truth of this, that he was more worried about objections from other mathematicians.
Oh, he was. And what he called the peripatetics. So the peripatetics being the
Aristotelians.
Who were Aristotelians and who were just conservatives. So this is why Morris Finocchiaro, who's one of the great modern current scholars of the Galileo Affair, he gets very frustrated by the whole science versus religion angle, because he says that completely misunderstands what was going on with Galileo. I'll get back to Copernicus in a second, but that misunderstands what was happening with Galileo, because it wasn't science versus religion. There were scientists on both sides of both camps. There were religious figures, very senior ones, on both sides. It was conservatives versus radicals. And so on one hand, you had the people who just wanted to stick to how things had always been and didn't like the fact that they were discovering phases of Venus and rings around, moons around Jupiter and what turned out to be rings around Saturn. And then you had people who were very excited by that. And it was a classic conservatives versus like the new wave. Mm-hmm. And once you start to look at it in that perspective, a lot of it makes a hell of a lot of sense. So I always say that if you look at it as this science versus religion thing, you're actually distorting the picture, and so you're never going to get what was really going on. Why is Galileo going to Rome and meeting with cardinals in 1624 to talk about how the new Pope Urban the VIII can maybe help them to get this new book published?
Right.
Shouldn't the cardinals have been on the other side? Shouldn't they have been reporting into the Inquisition? Because that only makes sense once you understand that it wasn't a science versus religion clash. But with Copernicus, the one that I like to roll out in front of people is the fact that the Pope of the time, Clement VII, I think it was, heard about Copernicus's theory. And this was long before the publication of De Revolutionibus, about 10 years before, and found it really interesting. And so he invited Johann Wittgenstein, who was lecturing on astronomy in Rome, to the Vatican Gardens to give a lecture to himself, several cardinals, and his whole household. And you mentioned this in your podcast. So when people are trying to say to me, that the church hated the whole idea, really? Because the Pope in the mid 16th century didn't seem to. He seemed to find the whole idea quite fascinating. Yeah. And we had cardinals encouraging Copernicus, sponsoring. He was sponsored by a bishop, etc., etc.
Right, and then even the sitting pope at the time of Galileo's trial was an acquaintance at least, and a one-time admirer, and someone that loved his discoveries as an astronomer, right? Yeah. And like wrote poetry attesting to that,
praising him and talking about how much he was. Look, I think we could probably say that Urban that Barberini, as he was, and then Urban once he became Pope, and Galileo were friends as much as someone as high and mighty and important as the Pope could be friends with a mere mathematicus. Yeah. So, I mentioned that visit to Rome by Galileo in 1624. He had multiple, I think it was 10 audiences with the Pope. Now, that's incredible. Most people would be honoured to have one, and he had a significant amount of time with him. And what was going on there was they had discovered a chink in the Pope's armour, because the thing about Urban is that while he was a great admirer of Galileo's, and he was he was very learned when it came to natural philosophy and astronomy. He didn't believe that any of the models that were under discussion at the time, the Tychonian, the Copernican, the Keplerian, the Ptolemaic, he didn't believe that any of them could actually be demonstrated to be true.
Sure.
He thought that, and so he actually, because he thought that doing that put a limit on the omnipotence of God. So he had to be convinced about writing on this topic again. And the way they did that was they said the Protestants are laughing at us. So the Protestants were all a pack of ignorant idiots.
Yeah.
And he was outraged by that. And that was the angle that Galileo used. And that's why he got permission to write the book. But the reason, the interesting thing there is extreme conditions were put around what he could do with that book. One of the things he had to do is he had to include that argument by the Pope. So he had to include the argument that ultimately we can never know because this limits God's omnipotence, and that is the final word, literally in the last day of the dialogue.
The dialogue, yeah.
But it's said by Simplicio.
Right. He just couldn't help himself.
He just in Australia we call it shit stirring. You just you shouldn't, but you do it anyway because it's funny. And the thing was, I mean, a lot of people, and you kind of talked about whether putting the Pope's arguments and the argument the Pope's preferred on omnipotence in the mouth of a guy whose name could be interpreted as the simpleton, and who definitely came off second best in the dialogue. That could have been what angered the Pope and caused the whole affair. A lot of people say that there's actually no direct evidence.
No, there really isn't. And I tried to be careful about that because there was stuff that I read that was like leading you to be like the Jesuits were in the Pope's ear. And the Jesuits like convinced the Pope that Simplicio was him. And I tried to be really careful to say, like, there's no proof of that, right? Like the Jesuits were certainly pushing the Inquisition towards investigating Galileo or whatever. I'm sure I'm not using the right terminology there, but starting their process with Galileo. But like the idea that there were sort of, the guys in his ear, that actually rang hollow to me because everything I'd learned about Urban VIII was that like he was a well-read enough man himself that he could really draw his own conclusions about what Galileo's book was about. And like, he didn't need people telling him how to interpret something like that. That didn't seem in keeping with his character. Now, and it's sometimes hard to get a sense of a character like Urban VIII because there's some stuff you'll read about him that'll tell you that he was just like the most venial and what would be the right word? Vain, maybe is the right word. Man, that he was just like kind of the worst example kind of a stuck-up Renaissance prince. And so it all came down to just clashes of personality that he just could not stomach being disrespected in this way. And I kind of shied away from that in my show just because like I just felt like I hadn't read enough to really make a character judgment on Urban VIII. And because also he seems really different from the time that he's a cardinal and then the time that he's a pope.
Well, I think that last point is well observed. My comment on Urban would be that I think he was able to be much more himself as a cardinal. Not surprisingly, becoming head of the entire Catholic Church and the height of the Counter-Reformation and the 30 Years' War put a bit of strain on him. I would argue that he was very proud. Yeah, and you can certainly see in some of the correspondence. And the reaction to the dialogue when it came out, paranoid. He was under a lot of political pressure from the Holy Roman Empire, or basically from the Spanish, who felt that he was taking sides in the 30 Years' War, which by that stage had resolved itself into a war between two Catholic powers, France and
Right.
Spain. And the Spanish cardinals were pursuing a policy in Rome where basically they were saying that he was a bit too Italian, just a little bit too laid back, a little bit too friendly with maybe people who are a bit suspect.
Sure.
And then in that context, Galileo brings out this book, which is an absolute bombshell, which was meant to be this sort of even-handed dialogue, and obviously very clearly is not. It's very clearly weighted in favour of Copernicanism, and then that's really what angered the Pope initially. Then when he read it, he found that an argument which his master of the palace, Niccolo Riccardi, who had been doing the negotiation with Galileo about what he could and couldn't write, had explicitly told Galileo he couldn't use, and that was his argument from the tides.
Yeah.
There it was, front and centre on the final day of the dialogue. That's probably when Urban hit the roof. And then they go on and looked into what Galileo had been instructed back in 1616, and they found that case note saying you should not discuss this in writing or in any way.
Yeah.
And that would have been what really made the Pope angry. And pretty much from that point on, Galileo's goose was entirely cooked.
Yeah.
It was just a matter of how much they humiliated him before, and then how much they were going to punish him.
And that's a point that, again, when we were kind of corresponding, you made that point about the argument about the tides, and that was something that I did not include in the podcast, and I probably should have, and I can tell you why I didn't. It's because I knew that like one of the things that Galileo was working on, like in those intervening years between 1616 and 1633, was this what to me seemed like a pet project. And so this is my own bias coming out, which because I'm looking at it and I realize now on further reflection, I was looking back at it from a modern perspective, which told me that he was wrong about what caused the tides.
Yeah.
And for the listeners, Galileo had, and again, I'm going to paraphrase it because I found the whole theory of the tides very confusing, because it was wrong. You're like kind of looking at someone's bad math, essentially, which is very confusing. But his theory essentially was that the tides were not caused by the gravitational pull of the moon. He believed that the tides were caused by the rotation of the Earth. And so, and am I getting that right, Tim?
You are. Yeah, you are.
Yeah. And so like, he had this whole elaborate mathematical justification for how the rotation of the Earth caused the tides that you experience on the shore of any ocean. And so this was sort of yet more proof towards like the Earth moves. There's movement of the Earth. Not only is the Earth going around the sun, but it's also sort of revolving, on its own axis, right? But he was wrong. But like the whole theory of the tides thing was entirely wrong. It was one of Galileo's just missteps. He didn't get it right. And so because of that, I was like, well, this was just like a weird flight of fancy. Why is he so obsessed with this? And, again, this was something you pointed out to me, is that, no, this ended up being kind of a crucial part of what may have upset the Pope, was because the Pope himself was not a fan of this theory of the tides.
Yeah, it really was. And it was almost like a comedy of errors, because Riccardi, the master of the palace, who the Pope had kind of said, okay, you go and talk to Galileo about how we're going to allow this book to be published. You read his correspondence, this wasn't his favourite piece of homework. He was also an incredibly busy guy. So he ended up outsourcing the reading of the manuscript of the dialogue to someone else. But the someone else didn't realise it wasn't across all the correspondence, and so he didn't realise that Galileo wasn't meant to be making this argument.
Right.
Galileo probably would have known that, but he just sort of kept quiet. And then the book came out, because he honestly thought, because he's Galileo, he honestly thought he would carry all before him with the power of his argument.
Yes.
And just didn't, because he was also a bit of a nerd, didn't realise that he was walking into a political minefield. and then until the mines started to go off. And even then, there are people writing to him in 1632 saying, you can get out of this. And he was like, no, I'm going to go to Rome and I will argue my case. And they were like, this is a really bad idea.
Yeah.
And you will see the point in the transcript of the trial where the penny dropped and he realised that they had him by the short and curlies. And it's quite remarkable. But going back to your point about the theory of the tides, yeah, it does seem bonkers to us because we know it's wrong. But the funny thing about that is that people then knew it was wrong too and pointed out problems. You know, his theory requires there to be one tide a day, and there's two.
Right.
So it wasn't like people at the time didn't realise the flaws in it. He also argued with Kepler about what caused tides and rejected Kepler's correct idea that it was the moon. And he called it an occult action. He said there's no mechanism, which was true. Until Newton came along, there wasn't.
Until they fully understood gravity. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but Kepler, I always say in this whole thing that Kepler is the unsung hero of this story. And it's absolutely ridiculous that we're always talking about Galileo.
Yeah, and that's partially, but I think Galileo himself kind of does Kepler dirty in the whole thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, because they corresponded, but Galileo didn't really give Kepler a hell of a lot of time. And Kepler was the guy who actually got it all mostly right, largely for wrong reasons. And this is the other funny thing. He believed in sacred geometry and a whole lot of weird mystical stuff, which led him to stuff that was actually true. But I think the other interesting thing is the dynamic. I was just talking there about the dynamic of the trial. And here's where I found that you had been led astray. And it was James Reston, who's a journalist who wrote a biography of Galileo, who, Sebastian, you in good faith read and thought this guy he's a best-selling, well-regarded author. He's written lots of books on history. Why wouldn't you take it as that his account as being correct? But what he did was he flipped around this sequence of events in the trial. So he had, them producing the case note from 1616 saying you were instructed not to discuss this in any way. And he then has Galileo pull out a letter from Cardinal Bellarmine, the then head of the Inquisition, saying, he hasn't been condemned of anything and he's right to keep doing his work. But it was exactly the other way around. And it was remarkable to me when I heard you present that sequence in that way. I thought, wow, where's he got that from? And then I went and did a bit of homework and found that he's this well-regarded published author, James Reston. He has clearly deliberately flipped it around to make it a more dramatic story. But what happens is it's the other way around. He brings out this letter from Bellarmine and says, what's the problem? I've got this letter from Bellarmine saying I'm in the clear. And they say, do you remember what was said to you in 1616 when you were given this injunction? And he said, I kind of think so. He must have realised that he was being backed into a trap. I kind of recall that it meant that I could sort of discuss it. And then they're reading the actual injunction that says, do not discuss it in any way. And then he starts backpedaling like the Tour de France, like well, that wasn't quite my memory, but maybe I was wrong, But what Reston does, and I've got an article that I may have shared with you already on this guy calls himself the Cosmic Skeptic. This kid at Oxford University, he's about 21. But he did a whole video on what really happened at the Galileo trial. And he makes it out that the case note that they skewered him with was a forgery. He says they forged it. And Reston, I understand, goes down that path as well.
He leaves the door open for that. So I was careful not to indulge because thankfully he was not my only source, but I did, you caught me, right? Like, so, and fair enough, right? And again, like, those of us out there that present ourselves as Mythbusters, I think have to be open to this kind of scrutiny because otherwise, what the hell are we doing out here? And so, I was I didn't rely entirely on Reston, but I did obviously. And you found them all. You were like, oh, I bet you took that detail from Reston. I bet you took that detail, and you were right. You were right on every count. And I was like, oh man, who am I dealing with here? But again, like I said, I want to be transparent about that because it's just a reminder that you got to go to the primary sources, and I should have. And what made the Reston book useful was just that it presented the story in such a sort of brisk narrative that it was like, okay, what was happened there again? Okay, I can just go back and kind of refer to it. But I noticed that Reston was like, maybe that injunction from the church, the minutes from the original Bellarmine meeting, had been a forgery. But I had enough other books. So the one was Galileo in Rome was Mariano Artigas and his co-author, whose name is escaping me.
And Artigas.
Yeah. And so they are like very like kind of like there's really no evidence. And then I kind of double checked it off of I had a whole series of it was a collection of sort of smaller essays called Galileo and the Church that I was referencing, and basically most sort of scholars are like there's really no reason to doubt the legitimacy of those minutes that were created in 1616, and Reston doesn't go like they were manufactured by his enemies, but he does go like maybe he kind of just sort of he kind of does the like, well, maybe his enemies did this, and he leaves the door open, and I did my, and again, that was one that I did catch, and so I will, but you're right, I did flip around the order of that, which does sort of tell a different story, because it makes Galileo more sort of, it makes it a better courtroom scene, what I mean? Which again, I should always be skeptical of that, like when the story is just a little too perfect, when it's just like, bring in the letters, boys, like you should really be around that.
It was a little bit too Hollywood, I mean, and Galileo comes out the hero. And this is the other problem I have with Reston's account. It is very readable, but it's also a little bit dramatized. And so he quite often has inquisitors thundering and shouting and frustration and so on. You read the transcript and it's not even, you get a summary, you get a paraphrase of what they said. So they could have just said it in a bored whisper. We don't know. So he's kind of adding this sort of embroidery. The other bit that you did mention, and again, it comes from Reston, is that Galileo was threatened with torture and was in genuine danger of being tortured. And Reston makes a reference to a terrible instrument called the heretic's fork, which is the instrument that was used to torture heretics. Now, the problem with all this is, first of all, Galileo was never in any danger of being tortured because the Inquisition had, as weird as it sounds to us, quite complicated rules regarding who could be tortured, and sick people couldn't be tortured, old people couldn't be tortured, and clerics, priests couldn't be tortured, or clergymen couldn't be tortured. And Galileo was all three. He was too old. He was over 60. He was sick. He'd recently been very ill, and he had taken a tonsure, so he had received a clerical benefice and was officially a member of the clergy, even though he wasn't actually an ordained clergyman. So he couldn't have been tortured. Now, the Inquisition could have overruled their own rules, but they generally didn't. And the other problem there with the Reston claim about the heretic's fork is I can find no evidence of any such instrument ever being used in that period. It seems to be one of these invented torture devices that were dreamed up by 18th and 19th century gentlemen, possibly ones with sadomasochistic sexual fantasies, and things like the pear of anguish, which is inserted in the rectum and opened up, and these things you see them in books about terrible things the Inquisition did. You actually look at the Inquisition's manuals and so on; they were quite open about torture, but it was generally hanging someone by a rope until they tell you what. I mean, it's nasty, but it was done recently by the CIA. So it's quite an effective way of torturing people. But things like the heretic's fork and so on. So I think we the lesson is, as you just said, If it sounds too good to be true, if it sounds just a little bit too dramatic,
Yeah.
probably not true. Which sort of leads us, I suppose, Sebastian, to something I did want to discuss with you, which is, in your experience, because I've got some thoughts on this. How do you think is the best way to convince people that these myths aren't true?
Great question. I mean, part of the reason why myths catch on is because they're good stories and because they are so repeatable. And so you have to give someone a new story. And I really see my show as a storytelling podcast first. Even though I want it to be accurate, even though, of course, as we said before, I'm presenting myself as a mythbuster, and I don't want to, take that lightly. But when I'm putting my shows together, I am always thinking about the narrative that I am trying to craft, which I think makes it more listenable. And so you need to give people a new story. And part of it, I think, and this is what I try and do with my show, is you can still have fun with the myth, right? Like I like these fake stories as curiosities, as like odd little artifacts, just as long as we don't put too much stock in them, just as so long as we don't find ourselves believing them. And as we've sort of come out in this discussion, like I know that there's been stories that have sort of so thoroughly made their way into my kind of historical consciousness that even I don't catch myself sometimes. And despite now, like, I'm closing in on 200 episodes, right? And so what I think helps is, like, sometimes when you're debunking anything, it can sound like you're just checking someone's math homework.
Yeah.
And people will not always remember the ins and outs of how you checked their math homework. And sometimes people might even resent that you went through and like pointed out that they didn't carry the one.
Yeah.
And so what I do on my show, or what I try to do anyway, is go like, you're not stupid for having believed this story in the first place. You're not, you haven't done anything wrong because you believed this story in this first place. If you heard this story at all and believed it, you believed it because there's something about that narrative that resonated with you and has resonated with people for a long time. And so part of the fun is being like, what is that thing that resonates? Like, what is that, in the Galileo story, it's part of this bigger narrative we've constructed about this war between science and religion. And so, making Galileo into this martyr of science fits within a grander narrative, and fits within certain narratives about the Roman Catholic Church, and fits within narratives about enlightenment and about ideas of progress and what have you. And so it resonates on that level. But if you can go like, no, there is a real story here, and it's a real human story. And to me, as we sort of talked about before, like I had to find the thing in that story that was true, despite the errors I still managed to make. And again, I'm trying to do my best to fess up to them and be open about them. I'm like, yeah, I trusted a book I should have been even more skeptical of, which can happen. But it's never too late to sort of make the correction and make it right. But at the same time, how will people sort of know the new story or the more accurate story of Galileo? Well, in my show, I was like, well, here's a detail I learned about him, that he was the Wrangler. And that, like, if you go like, oh yeah, he was like that in university, but maybe that personality trait was something that carried throughout his life. And the more I learned about it, and the more I kept on seeing it come back again and again. I was like, yeah, like the invention of the telescope, that whole story is like him kind of doing a little bit of wrangling, right? And even the writing of the dialogue on the two chief world systems is him, again being like, maybe I can just make this work. I think I can sneak this past. Like I can make this happen. I'm going to bring them around to my way of seeing things. That to me is just another indication of who he's always was. And I think if you can tell people that story, they're like, oh, okay. Now I can sort of understand maybe what went on here. Exactly. And then from there, you just flesh it out with more and more nuance. And you've studied it for so long that you've become a bit of an amateur expert. And that's why you can catch podcasters like me when we make a slip, No,
the real expert on this is Thony Christie. And if you have a look at my video channel or my podcast, you'll see a massive 3-part conversation I had with Thony, who has exhaustive knowledge on this stuff. But I love your point there about give them another story, because that is exactly the advice that I got from David Hutchings. So I had an interview with David Hutchings and James Ungurianu, who have written a book together on the conflict thesis, so the myth that science and religion have always been in conflict. And what the interesting thing there is that David is a high school teacher, and so is good at telling stories in ways that will engage bored 15-year-olds. You can probably relate to that. Whereas James is an academic who specialises in the history of science and religion. So what they were able to do is James kind of provided the historical heft, and then David put the spin on it. That and where he kind of got to was, well, here's a story of how two men, Draper and White, back in the 19th century, fooled the whole world, and so people still think that this conflict thesis is true, even though historians rejected it 100 years ago, which I think was a really, really good angle. Whereas maths homework checkers like me would just go, well, no, that's wrong. And you're an idiot for getting that wrong. So I think the lesson I'm learning from you and from David, Sebastian, is give them another story. I do try to do that, I think, but I think I don't do it enough. So I'm trying to think now of, okay, how can I tell these stories in a different way so that people go away with the correct story in a way that they actually engage with? Because you sort of said, people get very emotionally committed. I found, someone asked me on Reddit the other day, in all your debunking, what are the ones that people react to most negatively? And it would be probably the Jesus myth idea. So people who don't believe Jesus existed at all, they get very angry with me for being an atheist who does.
Sure.
I think he did exist.
It was like a person, sure.
Yeah. As a person, yeah. But the one that really gets people angry is when I say, well, actually, no, Christmas, Easter, and Halloween are not originally pagan festivals. They're Christian. And there might be some elements of some of the practices that might be pre-Christian, and maybe we could even call them pagan, but on the whole, they're Christian. And people get really angry because they were taught, usually as kids, and I find stuff when the people absorb when they were very small children, it's much harder to dislodge that than if they picked it up yesterday.
Yeah.
So I do admire the way in which you've been able to do that, Sebastian, because every time I listen to one of your episodes, and I love the one on the Renaissance, I love the one on the Dark Ages, and I particularly loved the one on guns, germs, and steel.
Oh, thanks.
I think that was a really good and even-handed and fair analysis of what a book that I loved when I first read it, and have had to kind of reevaluate. And I now direct, whenever anyone asks me what's wrong with guns, germs, and steel, I say, well, not everything, but some things. And
right.
Go and listen to Sebastian's podcast on the subject.
Well, thank you. That's really kind of you to say. And anytime I do get anything wrong on the show, it's just like, it hits me like, no. And you've been you're a very I'd say thoughtful and incisive is what I was trying to say. Very thoughtful and incisive listener. So, all those compliments actually mean a lot coming from you, because I know that you listen very carefully and have very high standards. And so I appreciate that. And, yeah, and I think and this is why I wanted to come on and engage with you. So, I can direct my listeners to this and be like, hey, look, the Galileo series, I did my utmost to make it like the most accurate series. And then, listener and podcaster in his own right, Tim O'Neill, has had a number of like really important points to bring up about some of the things I said. So I'll direct them to this. But you know what? I just want to say one more thing about narrative, is that narrative is extremely powerful. And so like you have to like wield it responsibly, right? Because in as much as I think the way that you bring people around to a more accurate understanding is by giving them a new narrative, it's so easy to just like use that power for evil, or if not use that power for evil, the desire to sort of wrap up your tale in a satisfying way can sometimes lead you towards inaccuracy or creating new myths. And so you have to be sort of guided by an honest desire to I guess educate is maybe the right word. And so narrative is a powerful tool, and ultimately I think what I've been exploring on the show the past 7 years is the power of narratives. And so, while wielding them myself, and so I've gotten an all new respect for that. And so, I mean, I think that's what I wanted to say about that. I didn't have a nice little cherry on top of that, but ironically, that's what we're talking about.
But what I would say is, I really appreciated when you said you would come on my show, because I have a lot of experience of people who I've critiqued, and they just completely flatly reject what I'm saying. They can't actually argue against it, but they just, they attack me personally, or they say that I'm not, a lot of them are atheists, and they say, well, he's not a real atheist, he's actually a Christian apologist, which is kind of hilarious. Or they seem, they totally ignore me. And occasionally, very occasionally, they will respond to me, but they don't actually counter what I say, and they just kind of pretend they do. So it's great to have someone. You probably don't have the ideological dog that they have in the fight.
No.
But it was nice for you to come back and say, hey, thanks for your comments, and also for you to agree to come on and have this conversation, which I think has been a really fruitful chat.
Oh yeah,
because I think I can learn a lot from you about that narrative bit. My next major article on my blog is going to be about the Inquisition. That's going to be really tough, because it's hard to debunk the myths about the Inquisition, of which there are many, without it making it sound as though you're saying, well, the Inquisition was actually okay.
Yeah.
I'm actually all right with people being burnt at the stake and tortured for their beliefs, which I'm most definitely not. So that's going to be tricky. What narrative do I present there? So I'll have to give that some thought. But Sebastian, do appreciate you coming on the show. We've talked for just over an hour, so I think we've covered a hell of a lot of ground in that time. I've really appreciated the conversation. Thank you for coming on History for Atheists, and maybe we'll see you again sometime in the future.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate it, and thanks for all your great questions.
No problem. Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sebastian. He's a great example of someone who is open-minded and therefore open to critique and even prepared to change his mind, something not often seen these days. Hopefully we'll have him back on History for Atheists sometime in the future. But in the meantime, please check out Our Fake History. I'll put a link in this program's description. This is probably the last program on History for Atheists for 2022, so I look forward to giving you more to enjoy in the coming year. Have a great Christmas, and see you again here soon.